A decorated police officer, a pillar of his precinct for 2 decades, makes a fatal mistake. During a routine traffic stop, fueled by anger and prejudice, he spits in the face of a black man. He thought it was a moment of dominance, a secret that would vanish on the shimmering asphalt of a hot summer day. He had no idea the man he just assaulted was not only an innocent citizen, but was about to become his new boss. This is the story of Officer David Miller, and how one vile act of hate didn't just end his career, but triggered a chain of events that would unravel his entire life, exposing a dark secret he thought was buried forever. The air in Bridgewater was thick and heavy, the kind of oppressive August humidity that made polyester uniforms feel like shrink wrap. For Senior Officer David Miller, badge number 724, it was just another Tuesday. For 22 years he'd been a fixture in the Bridgewater Police Department, a man whose presence was as solid and unyielding as the concrete precinct building itself. He was what the rookies called a cop's cop. He knew every back alley, every corner where trouble brewed, and he carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed he was the sole author of justice on his streets. His kingdom was Sector 4, a sprawling, gritty part of the city, where the lines between right and wrong were, in his view, often blurred for everyone but him. Today, his partner was Chris O'Connell, a kid barely 5 years on the force, still full of academy-forged optimism that Miller found both naive and irritating. "Hear anything about the new Chief O'Connell?" asked, breaking the silence in their patrol car as they idled near a park where teenagers were skateboarding, their laughter echoing in the soupy air. Miller grunted his eyes, scanning the street. Another suit from out of town. Some diversity hire from a big city department, probably. They'll come in, talk about community engagement and de-escalation, change a few policies that look good on paper, and be gone in 3 years. Nothing ever really changes, kid. The outgoing chief, a man named Henderson, who had been Miller's friend for years, was retiring. His departure left a power vacuum, and the rumor mill had been churning for weeks. The city council had kept the selection process under tight wraps, promising an outsider who would bring a new era of transparency and accountability to the BPD. To Miller, those were just code words for making a cop's job harder. "I don't know," O'Connell mused. "Maybe a fresh perspective is what we need. Things have been tense, especially after the Franklin case." Miller's jaw tightened. The Franklin case was a sore spot, a controversial shooting involving 2 of their own, which had been ruled justified, but had torn a rift between the community and the police. Miller saw it as a clean shoot. The public, egged on by activists, saw it as murder. The Franklin case was handled, Miller said, his voice dropping to a low growl. 2 cops went home to their families. End of story. The problem isn't our perspective, Chris. It's that we've let the criminals and the complainers get the microphone. He was a man of absolutes. In his world, there were cops and there were crooks. There were law-abiding citizens and there were troublemakers. The categories rarely overlapped. His methods were old-school, forged in a time when a cop's word was gospel and a nightstick was a valid tool of persuasion. He'd racked up commendations for bravery, but also a string of citizen complaints that had been quietly buried by a friendly internal affairs division under Chief Henderson. "Let's roll," Miller finally said, putting the car in drive. "This heat is making me lazy." They spent the next few hours on routine calls, a domestic dispute that ended with a sheepish husband apologizing a shoplifting call at a convenience store where a scared kid had stolen a loaf of bread. Miller handled it all with a gruff, detached efficiency. He saw himself as the grizzled veteran teaching the young O'Connell the ropes of real police work. "You see that kid," Miller said, after they let the shoplifter go with a warning. You were ready to write him a book. You got a look at them, Chris. See the story. Scared kid hungry. No record. Wasting 2 hours booking him helps nobody. You learn to pick your battles. This was the paradox of David Miller. He could show a moment of what looked like compassionate wisdom only to follow it with an act of startling cruelty. His judgment was a pendulum, and its swing was dictated entirely by his own internal set of rules that were deeply colored by prejudice. He didn't see himself as a racist. He saw himself as a realist. He believed he had a gift for pattern recognition, for spotting trouble before it started. But over 2 decades, his patterns had hardened into stereotypes, and his realism had curdled into a corrosive cynicism that saw the worst in certain people on sight. As the sun began to dip, painting the hazy sky in hues of orange and purple, a call came over the radio about a noise complaint at a rundown apartment complex. It was a nothing call, but it was in their sector. As they pulled away from the curb, Miller felt that familiar thrum of authority, the quiet satisfaction of being the one who brought order to chaos. He was Officer David Miller King of Sector 4, and in his kingdom, his word was law. He had no idea that in less than an hour, he was about to make a decision that would burn that kingdom to the ground. The afternoon heat was starting to relent, but the temper of the city remained frayed. Miller and O'Connell were heading back toward the precinct when a dark grey sedan, a respectable but unremarkable car, glided through an intersection a block ahead. Miller's eyes narrowed. He rolled that stop sign O'Connell asked, already knowing the answer didn't matter. Close enough, Miller muttered, flicking on the patrol car's lights. The sedan immediately and properly pulled over to the side of the road, its movements smooth and unhurried. There was no sudden lurch, no sign of panic. For some reason, this calm compliance irritated Miller. It felt like a challenge. He swaggered up to the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. O'Connell took up the standard position, by the passenger side, his expression neutral. Inside the car sat a black man in his late 40s. He was dressed in a simple, well-fitting polo shirt and slacks. He wasn't wearing expensive jewelry, but he had an air of quiet dignity about him. His hands were placed visibly on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. License and registration. Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of any courtesy. The man didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked at Miller, his gaze level and intelligent. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over?" The question was polite, respectful even. But to Miller, it was defiance. It was questioning his authority. "You rolled the stop sign back there?" "Now license and registration. Please, Miller," repeated his voice, taking on a harder edge. The man slowly reached for the glove compartment, his movements deliberate. "My name is Marcus Thorne," he said calmly. "My license and registration are in here. I'm moving very slowly, so there are no misunderstandings." "Just get it," Miller snapped. Mr. Thorne produced the documents and handed them over. Miller snatched them, his eyes scanning the name. Marcus Thorne. The address was in one of the city's more affluent suburbs. Miller's lip curled into a slight sneer. "What are you doing in this part of town?" Mr. Thorne Miller asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. Sector 4 was not the suburbs. I was looking at a commercial property officer. "I'm considering a new business investment in the area," Thorne replied, his voice still unnervingly steady. Everything about the man, his calm demeanor, his educated speech, his nice car in this rundown neighborhood, grated on Miller's nerves. It didn't fit his pre-written narrative. In Miller's world, a man like this, in a place like this, was either lost or looking for trouble. "Business investment," Miller scoffed, handing the license back. "Right. I'm going to give you a warning this time, but I suggest you pay more attention to traffic signs when you're scouting for business." The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. O'Connell shifted his weight uneasily. This was classic Miller, pushing and prodding, trying to provoke a reaction he could then use as justification. Marcus Thorne looked from his license back to Miller's face. There was no fear in his eyes, only a profound sense of disappointment. "Thank you for the warning, officer. But for the record, I came to a full and complete stop at that sign. I believe your own dash cam will confirm that." That was it. That was the line. By challenging Miller's word, by invoking the camera, Thorne had moved from being a subject of a traffic stop to an enemy. He had questioned the king in his own kingdom. Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. He leaned in closer to the open window, his face inches from Thorne's. "Are you calling me a liar?" He hissed his voice, a low and venomous whisper. "I'm stating a fact," Thorne replied, his composure unwavering. "And I would appreciate it if you would step back. You're invading my personal space." Something inside David Miller snapped. Decades of resentment, of feeling unappreciated, of believing his kind of policing was under attack by a world that didn't understand him, it all coalesced into a single ugly impulse. It was pure, visceral contempt. He wasn't thinking about the badge, the uniform, or the law. He was thinking about putting this man, this calm, articulate man who refused to be intimidated, back in his place. He drew his head back, slightly gathered saliva in his mouth, and with a guttural, hateful sound, he spat directly into Marcus Thorne's face. A thick glob of spittle landed on the man's cheek, slowly tracing a path down his skin. The world seemed to stop. The traffic noise faded. The chirping of birds went silent. O'Connell froze his mouth agape in disbelief. He had seen Miller be rough. He had heard him be cruel. But this was something else, entirely. It was a violation so profound, so demeaning, it transcended a simple assault. It was a message of pure disgust. Marcus Thorne didn't flinch. He did not wipe his face. He didn't curse or yell. He simply sat there for a long moment, the spittle glistening on his skin, his eyes locked on Miller's. The calm in his gaze was replaced by something far more powerful, a cold, hard, diamond-like focus. It was the look of a man engraving an image onto his soul. Miller, for his part, felt a surge of triumphant adrenaline. He had broken the man's composure. He had won. "Now get the hell out of my city," Miller snarled, though the words lacked the conviction of his previous anger. A tiny, cold seed of doubt was beginning to plant itself in his gut. Then Marcus Thorne finally moved. He reached for a handkerchief in his pocket, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he wiped the spittle from his face. He looked at the handkerchief, then back at Miller. His voice, when he spoke, was preternaturally calm, but it carried a weight that seemed to shake the very air in the car. "Officer," he said, his eyes boring into Miller's, "what is your name and badge number?" "It's on my uniform," Miller sneered, tapping his chest. "You got a problem with that, you can file a complaint." Thorne's gaze dropped to the badge. "Officer David Miller, badge 724. He repeated the name and number slowly, as if committing them to memory. He then looked over at the other officer. "And you, officer, you are a witness to this." O'Connell just stared, paralyzed. Thorne turned his attention back to Miller. The finality in his tone was chilling. "Your conduct has been noted. Officer Miller, every single detail. Have a good day." Without another word, he put his car in drive and pulled away from the curb, merging flawlessly back into traffic. He didn't speed away. He just left. As the grey sedan disappeared, Miller stood on the roadside, his chest still puffed out, but the adrenaline was fading, replaced by that cold, growing unease. "What the hell was that?" O'Connell whispered, his voice trembling slightly. That Miller said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow, even to himself, was putting a mouthy son of a bitch in his place. Lesson for you, kid. Sometimes you gotta remind them who's in charge. But as he walked back to the patrol car, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus Thorne's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a defeated man. They were the eyes of a judge. The drive back to the precinct was shrouded in a thick, suffocating silence. The usual post-shift banter was gone, replaced by the low hum of the engine and the crackle of the radio. Officer Miller tried to project an air of nonchalant victory, but the bravado was a thin veneer over a growing chasm of anxiety. He kept replaying the incident in his head, and with each replay, Marcus Thorne's final chilling words echoed louder. Your conduct has been noted. Every single detail. O'Connell sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his face pale. He was replaying the incident too, but with a sick, churning feeling in his stomach. He'd witnessed an assault. Not a shove in a tense arrest or a harsh word during an interrogation, but a calculated, demeaning act of pure malice. And he had done nothing. He had stood there, a sworn officer of the law, and watched his partner commit a crime. He's not going to do anything, Miller said abruptly, as if responding to O'Connell's unspoken thoughts. Guys like that, they make a lot of noise, but they don't file. They know it's his word against ours. A decorated cop and his partner versus some guy with an attitude. Who do you think Henderson's IA is going to believe? The mention of the outgoing chief was meant to be reassuring, a reminder of the old boys' club that had protected Miller for years. But O'Connell knew Henderson was a lame duck. His last day was Friday. A new chief was starting Monday, a complete unknown. "Dave, you spat on him," O'Connell said, his voice barely a whisper. That's not just a complaint. That's assault. It's whatever I say it is." Miller shot back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was belligerent, non-compliant. He made a furtive move. I felt threatened. We feared for our safety. Pick one. That's the story. Are we clear? He wasn't asking a question. He was giving an order. This was the blue wall of silence being built, brick by rhetorical brick, right there in the car. O'Connell felt a wave of nausea. He'd heard of this scene, minor versions of it, his whole career, officers covering for each other's minor mistakes, fudging details on a report to protect a partner. But this was different. This wasn't a mistake. It was a crime born of hate. "Dave," O'Connell started, but his voice trailed off. What could he say? Ratting out your partner was the ultimate sin in the cop world. It meant being blacklisted, ostracized. You'd be the guy no one would partner with, the one no one would trust to have their back in a dangerous situation. Your career would be over. Miller glanced at him, his eyes cold and hard. "Don't go wobbly on me, Chris. You're either on the team or you're not. You stood there, you saw it my way. That's how it has to be." When they got back to the precinct, the atmosphere was light, almost celebratory. Chief Henderson was making the rounds, shaking hands on his last week. Cops were laughing, planning his retirement party. Miller slipped back into his role as the veteran mainstay, clapping Henderson on the back, sharing an old war story. He was performing, trying to convince everyone, and perhaps himself, most of all, that it was just another day. O'Connell, however, couldn't shake the chill. He went to the locker room and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him wore the same uniform as David Miller. Did that make them the same? He splashed cold water on his face, the image of Marcus Thorne's calm, dignified expression as he was assaulted, burning behind his eyes. He knew he should go to his union rep, or maybe Captain Johnson, their direct supervisor. He should write a report. He should do something. But the fear was paralyzing. Fear of Miller's retribution, fear of the department's rejection. He thought of his wife, his mortgage, the baby they were trying for. A single report could jeopardize all of it. So he said nothing. That night, Miller went home and drank 3 fingers of bourbon. He told his wife he'd had a tough day, that the streets were getting worse. He didn't mention the traffic stop. He tried to push it from his mind, to bury it under the self-righteous justification he'd constructed. The guy was an arrogant punk who got what he deserved. End of story. But as he lay in bed that night, sleep wouldn't come. The silence of his quiet suburban home felt different. It felt like the silence in the car after Thorne drove away, heavy, judgmental, and echoing with unspoken consequences. For the rest of the week, an unspoken tension hung between Miller and O'Connell. They worked their shifts, went through the motions, but the easy camaraderie was gone. Miller was more volatile than usual, snapping at a jaywalker being overly aggressive on a routine wellness check. He was acting like a man trying to prove he was still in charge. O'Connell was quiet and withdrawn, his guilt eating at him like an acid. On Friday, the precinct threw a retirement party for Chief Henderson. There were speeches, a commemorative plaque, and a sheet cake with a badly drawn police badge on it. During his farewell speech, Henderson mentioned the incoming chief. "I know there's been a lot of speculation," Henderson said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't give you his name, yet City Hall wants to do a big press conference on Monday. But I can tell you this, he's a good man. A reformer, but a cop's cop at heart. He came up the hard way. He understands the street. I think you'll all be surprised." Miller scoffed into his beer. Surprised by how fast he can ruin a perfectly good department, he muttered to a nearby officer who chuckled in agreement. As the party wound down, Miller saw O'Connell leaving early. He caught up to him in the parking lot. "Hey, you okay, kid?" Miller asked, his tone softer than it had been all week. "I'm fine," O'Connell replied, not meeting his eyes. "Listen, about the other day," Miller started lowering his voice. "Forget about it. It's done. It was nothing. Just a bad stop. By Monday, it'll be like it never happened. New chief, clean slate." But O'Connell knew it wasn't nothing. It had happened. And as he drove home, he had a sinking feeling that Monday wasn't going to be a clean slate. It was going to be a day of reckoning. He just had no idea how literal that would be. Monday morning arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation at the Bridgewater Police Department. The air, usually thick with the scent of stale coffee and paperwork, buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone from the greenest rookie to the most jaded desk sergeant was speculating about the new chief. Would he be a hardliner, a political puppet? Would he clean house or maintain the status quo? Officer David Miller projected an aura of supreme indifference. He held court by the coffee machine, leaning back against the counter with the easy confidence of a tenured professor. "Mark my words," he announced to a small group of officers. "It'll be some pencil pusher who hasn't been on the street in 20 years. We'll be doing implicit bias training and yoga classes before Christmas." The other cops laughed, but their laughter was tight anxious. Miller's bravado was a shield for them all, a way to push back against the fear of the unknown. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Captain Johnson's voice boomed over the precinct intercom. "All personnel report to the main briefing room for the chief's introduction. All personnel briefing room. Now." The room filled quickly, a sea of blue uniforms and murmuring voices. Miller found a spot near the back with his usual cronies, arms crossed, a cynical smirk fixed on his face. O'Connell stood on the opposite side of the room, looking pale and restless, his eyes darting towards the door. At the front of the room a podium was set up. Mayor Thompson, a politician with a perpetually camera-ready smile, stood beside the city manager. They looked proud, like they were about to unveil a new sports car. The mayor tapped the microphone, and the room fell silent. "Good morning, everyone," he began, beaming. "Today marks a new chapter for the Bridgewater Police Department and for our great city. After a nationwide search, we sought a leader with unimpeachable integrity, a deep understanding of modern policing, and an unwavering commitment to both justice and community. We believe we have found exactly that person." Miller rolled his eyes. It was the same political boilerplate he'd heard a dozen times before. "This is a man who started as a beat cop in one of the toughest districts in Chicago," the mayor continued. "He rose through the ranks, detective sergeant captain, and eventually deputy superintendent. He has a law degree from Northwestern. He has testified before Congress on police reform. He is a leader for the 21st century. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you the new chief of the Bridgewater Police Department." There was a dramatic pause. The door behind the podium opened, and Marcus Thorne walked in. He wasn't wearing the simple polo shirt and slacks from the traffic stop. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, the crisp white of his shirt accentuating his powerful build. His shoes were shined to a mirror finish. He moved with an air of absolute command, his expression calm, professional, and unreadable. Time seemed to slow down. For a split second, Miller's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a glitch in the matrix, a hallucination brought on by a bad cup of coffee. This couldn't be happening. The man from the grey sedan, the man he had insulted, demeaned, assaulted. Then their eyes met. Across the crowded room, Chief Marcus Thorne's gaze found Officer David Miller. There was no flicker of anger, no hint of triumph. There was only a quiet, unnerving acknowledgement. It was the same cold, focused look he'd given Miller on that roadside, but this time it was backed by all the power and authority of the office he now held. A collective gasp rippled through the room as officers who had heard whispers of Miller's traffic stop bravado connected the dots. The smirk on Miller's face didn't just vanish. It was violently erased, replaced by a ghastly pallor. The blood drained from his head, and the room began to swim. He felt a cold sweat prickle his entire body. It was as if the floor had fallen away, leaving him in a free fall. Beside him, his friends stared, their mouths agape. They looked from the new chief to Miller, and back again, the horrifying truth dawning on them. Across the room, Chris O'Connell felt a dizzying mix of terror and a strange, shameful relief. The secret was out. The bomb had finally detonated. Chief Thorne stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the silent, stunned faces of his new command. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and resonant, filling the room with an authority that needed no shouting. "My name is Marcus Thorne, and it is an honor to serve as your new chief of police." He began his speech, laying out his vision for the department. He spoke of accountability, of how the badge was a symbol of public trust, a trust that had to be earned every day on every call. He spoke of transparency, of the importance of treating every single citizen with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were or what part of town they lived in. The power we hold is immense. Chief Thorne declared, his eyes scanning the faces before him, and it must be wielded with immense restraint and profound respect. There is no room in this department for arrogance. There is no room for abuse of power, and there is no room for officers who believe they are above the very laws they are sworn to uphold. With each word, Miller felt a new wave of nausea. This wasn't just a speech. It was a mission statement. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was Exhibit A. He was no longer the king of Sector 4. He was a ghost at a banquet, a man whose fate had been sealed on a hot Tuesday afternoon. The new era in the Bridgewater Police Department had begun, and David Miller was its first casualty. He just didn't know yet how slowly and how painfully his career and his life were about to be dismantled. The days following Chief Thorne's introduction were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Officer Miller arrived at work each morning, expecting a summons to the chief's office, a summary firing a public crucifixion. But the call never came. Chief Thorne walked the halls of the precinct, his presence a constant looming shadow, yet he never once addressed Miller directly. He would pass him in the hallway, offering a crisp professional nod, the same one he gave every other officer, but his eyes held that same unnerving, omniscient calm. This silence was far more terrifying than any outburst. It allowed Miller's paranoia to fester and grow, turning his own mind into a prison. His buddies, who had once laughed at his cynical jokes, now avoided his gaze. Their conversations would stop abruptly when he approached. He was a pariah, a man marked for death, and no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius when the axe finally fell. His partner O'Connell was a wreck. He requested a new partner, citing professional differences, a request that was granted with astonishing speed. O'Connell was reassigned to a veteran officer, known for his impeccable record, while Miller was paired with a sullen rookie who barely spoke to him. The message was clear. Miller was now an island. Then the changes began. They were subtle at first, then sweeping. Chief Thorne's first major policy directive was the immediate implementation of a mandatory body-worn camera policy for every officer with 0 exceptions. Furthermore, the footage from any interaction that resulted in a citizen complaint a use of force or was flagged by a new AI-driven linguistic analysis for unprofessional conduct would be subject to automatic immediate review by a newly formed civilian oversight board and a revamped internal affairs. The head of this new IA was a sharp, relentless lieutenant named Isabella Rossi, a woman Thorne had brought with him from Chicago. Rossi had a reputation as a bulldog who had rooted out corruption in her own department. She was immune to the blue wall of silence. Miller felt the walls closing in. Every interaction, every traffic stop was now under a microscope. He became stiff robotic, his old-school methods rendered obsolete overnight. The confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by a constant gnawing fear of making a mistake. One afternoon, Miller was writing a report when Captain Johnson called him into his office. "This is it." Miller thought, his heart pounding. But Johnson just slid a file across the desk. "Chief's orders. He wants a full review of all pending and recently closed cases from Sector 4 for the last 2 years. He wants to reevaluate prosecutorial viability and look for procedural inconsistencies." Procedural inconsistencies. It was a bland, bureaucratic term for screwing up. Miller looked at the stack of files. They represented 2 years of his work, his arrests, his word. It felt like his entire career was being put on trial. "He wants me to do this?" Miller asked, bewildered. He was very specific, Johnson said, refusing to meet his eyes. He said he wanted an officer with intimate knowledge of the sector to lead the initial review. Report is due in 30 days. It was a cruelly brilliant move. Thorne was forcing Miller to comb through his own history to confront every shortcut he'd ever taken, every report he'd ever embellished. He was being forced to dig his own grave. As Miller spent his days locked in the records room, surrounded by the ghosts of his past arrests, the department outside was transforming. Chief Thorne was a visible, active leader. He attended community meetings in Sector 4, listening to residents who had felt ignored for years. He started a youth outreach program. He promoted officers based on merit and community feedback, not just seniority and arrest numbers. The old guard grumbled, but a new energy was taking hold. Younger officers like O'Connell saw a path forward, a way to be a good cop without compromising their integrity. The karma was not a lightning strike. It was a slow, crushing pressure. Miller's friends stopped calling. His wife noticed his drinking had worsened, that he was angry and sullen all the time. His authority, the very core of his identity, had been stripped away, not in a blaze of glory, but through 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts. He found himself thinking about Marcus Thorne constantly. He tried to cling to the idea that Thorne was just a vengeful man enjoying his power. But the truth was more galling. Thorne wasn't being vengeful. He was simply being a good chief. He was fixing a broken system, and David Miller was one of the broken parts. The spitting incident hadn't been the cause of all this. It had merely been the symptom that revealed the disease. Thorne wasn't just punishing him for that single act. He was systematically dismantling the toxic culture that had allowed an officer like Miller to flourish for 22 years. One evening, deep in the dusty archives, Miller came across a particular file from about 18 months prior. The name on the tab read Peterson James. He remembered the case vaguely. A robbery, a shaky eyewitness ID. Miller had leaned on the suspect, a young black kid named Deshaun Peterson, and gotten a confession. It had been a clean, easy conviction. But as he reread his own report, now under the new unforgiving light of Chief Thorne's regime, the words seemed hollow. He remembered the kid insisting he was innocent, how his father, James Peterson, had begged and pleaded with him, saying his son was at a family barbecue. Miller had dismissed it as the usual lies. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He pulled the case's evidence log. A key piece of evidence, a security tape from a nearby store that the father claimed would exonerate his son, was listed as damaged during processing, unusable. Miller remembered spilling coffee on it. He hadn't thought it was important. He'd already had the confession. He closed the file, his hands trembling slightly. It was just one case, one of hundreds, but it felt different now. It felt like a ticking bomb he had planted himself, and Chief Thorne had just handed him the shovel and told him to start digging. Chris O'Connell couldn't sleep. For weeks, the image of the spitting incident played on a loop in his mind every time he closed his eyes. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He'd gotten his new partner, he was staying out of Miller's way, but the silence was its own kind of complicity. Every professional nod he received from Chief Thorne felt like a silent accusation. The chief knew he was there. He knew he had done nothing. Finally, after a long and agonizing conversation with his wife, who told him she couldn't live with a man who wouldn't do the right thing, O'Connell made a decision. He walked into the newly renovated offices of Internal Affairs and asked to speak with Lieutenant Rossi. He sat in a sterile interview room, the camera in the corner, a silent, unblinking eye. When Lieutenant Rossi entered, she didn't offer a handshake. She simply sat down, opened a folder and looked at him. Officer O'Connell. "What can I do for you?" His voice trembled as he began to speak. He recounted every detail of the traffic stop with Marcus Thorne. The flimsy pretext, Miller's escalating aggression, the hateful words, and the final disgusting act. He didn't spare himself detailing his own paralysis, his fear and his silence. When he was finished, the room was quiet. Rossi simply nodded, her expression unchanged. "Thank you for your statement, Officer O'Connell. Your honesty is appreciated." She made a few notes. "Was this an isolated incident in your experience?" This level of unprofessionalism from Officer Miller O'Connell hesitated. He thought of all the times Miller had used slurs under his breath, the unnecessary roughness, with minority suspects, the casual disdain he showed for the people of Sector 4. The spitting, that was the worst I've ever seen, O'Connell admitted. But the attitude behind it, no. That wasn't new. After O'Connell left, feeling as though a mountain had been lifted from his shoulders, Lieutenant Rossi made a call. An hour later, she was in Chief Thorne's office, presenting him with the official, on-the-record eyewitness statement. Thorne read the report slowly. "This corroborates my own account," he said, his voice level. "It gives the DA what they need to proceed with a criminal charge for assault." "Yes," Chief Rossi replied. "But I think we have something bigger here." O'Connell's statement suggests a pattern. "With your permission, I'd like to open a full formal investigation into Officer Miller's entire jacket. Every complaint, every use of force report, every arrest from the last 10 years. "Permission granted," Thorne said without hesitation. "Be thorough, Lieutenant." Rossi's investigation was a whirlwind of efficiency. The old dusty complaint files that had been buried under the Henderson administration were exhumed. A pattern quickly emerged. Dozens of complaints, almost all from minority citizens, all alleging verbal abuse, unwarranted searches, and excessive force by Officer Miller. All of them had been dismissed as unsubstantiated. But Rossi's team had a new tool, the directive from the Chief's office for Miller to review his own cases. Miller's anxious, half-hearted review had flagged several files with minor inconsistencies. To Rossi's trained eye, these inconsistencies were glaring red flags. One file in particular stood out: the robbery conviction of Deshawn Peterson. Rossi's investigators didn't just reread the report, they reinvestigated the case. They went to the Petersons' home. They found James Peterson, a tired, broken man who had spent the last 18 months trying to prove his son's innocence. "Officer Miller, I remember him," James Peterson told the investigators, his voice filled with a quiet, simmering rage. "He laughed at me. He told me my son was a thug and that he was going to rot in jail. I told him about the security camera at the bodega on the corner. I told him it would show Deshawn was with me, buying ice for the barbecue at the exact time of the robbery. He said he'd look into it." Rossi's team went to the bodega. The owner, a man named Mr. Smith, remembered the incident well. He also remembered Officer Miller coming to ask for the tape. "Yes, he took the tape," Mr. Smith said, "but he was very clumsy. He had a big cup of coffee and he spilled it. All over my counter, all over the tape. He said it was ruined. An accident." But it wasn't an accident. Rossi's team discovered that the bodega had recently upgraded its security system. While Miller had taken the physical tape, the entire system backed up to a cloud server, a detail Miller had never bothered to ask about. The footage still existed. They pulled the cloud recording. The timestamp was clear. At the exact moment the robbery was being committed 3 miles away, the video showed a smiling Deshawn Peterson at the counter of the bodega, holding a bag of ice, his father standing right behind him. It was an ironclad alibi. The confession Miller had secured was false, coerced out of a terrified teenager. The key piece of exculpatory evidence had been at best negligently destroyed, and at worst intentionally suppressed. An innocent young man had been sitting in a state prison for 1.5 years. This was the twist. The investigation, which had started with an act of spitting, had uncovered a far greater sin. It was no longer just about Officer Miller's prejudice. It was about the catastrophic consequences of that prejudice. He hadn't just assaulted a man on the street. He had stolen 1.5 years of a young man's life and destroyed his family. When Lieutenant Rossi presented her findings to Chief Thorne, the calm finally broke from his expression, replaced by a cold, hard fury. He looked at the file, the picture of a smiling Deshawn Peterson from the bodega, next to his grim-faced prison mugshot. "The DA's office is moving to vacate the conviction immediately," Rossi reported. "Deshawn Peterson should be released by the end of the week." Thorne nodded slowly. "And Officer Miller. The evidence supports charges of official misconduct, tampering with evidence, and potentially perjury, Rossi said. This goes far beyond simple assault. Thorne stared out his window at the city below. The karma for David Miller was no longer just about losing his job. It was about facing the ghost he had created, the living embodiment of his corruption. It was about justice, not just for Marcus Thorne, but for Deshawn Peterson. "Set up a meeting," Chief Thorne said, his voice like ice. "I want to see Officer Miller in my office tomorrow morning. It's time for his review to be concluded." The summons came via a sterile email. "Officer Miller, please report to the Chief's office tomorrow at 0800 hours for a performance review." There was no threat, no accusation, just the cold corporate language of a final judgment. David Miller spent that night in a haze of bourbon and dread. He knew this was the end. The weeks of psychological torment, the isolation, the review of his own files, it had all been a prelude to this moment. He walked into the precinct the next morning, like a man walking to the gallows. The building felt alien to him now. The crisp, clean halls of Thorne's new era, a stark contrast to the comfortable, worn-down precinct of his memory. Chief Thorne's office was on the top floor, a modern space with a large glass wall that overlooked the city, including the distant gritty blocks of Sector 4. When Miller entered, Thorne was not sitting behind his large desk. He was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Lieutenant Rossi stood silently in the corner, a thick file in her hands. "Officer Miller, thank you for coming. Please have a seat," Thorne said, his voice even and devoid of emotion. He gestured to a single chair placed in the middle of the room, facing the desk. It felt like an interrogation room. Miller sat his back ramrod straight, trying to muster the last dregs of his defiant pride. Thorne finally turned from the window and sat behind his desk. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply looking at Miller the same way he had on that roadside. "We are here to discuss your 22 years of service with the Bridgewater Police Department," Thorne began, "and to discuss why that service ends today." Miller's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "We could start with the events of August 12th, Thorne continued, his voice dangerously soft. "We could discuss a routine traffic stop for a non-existent violation. We could discuss a litany of unprofessional and abusive comments. We could discuss the act of spitting in a citizen's face, an act of assault for which your former partner, Officer O'Connell, has given a full and sworn statement." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "That alone is enough for termination and a criminal referral. But that Officer Miller is merely the tip of the iceberg. It's the symptom, not the disease." Thorne gestured to Rossi, who stepped forward and placed the thick file on the desk with a heavy thud. The name on the tab was stark, white, Peterson Deshawn. "This is what your disease looks like," Officer Thorne said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "This is the real cost of your brand of policing." He opened the file. He slid a photograph across the desk. It was the still frame from the bodega's security camera, showing a happy Deshawn Peterson buying a bag of ice. Then he slid another photo next to it. Deshawn's prison mug shot his eyes, hollow and hopeless. "You see, your little performance review of your own cases had an unintended consequence," Thorne explained, his eyes boring into Miller. "It drew our attention to this case. We decided to reinvestigate. We spoke to Mr. James Peterson. We spoke to the bodega owner. And most importantly, we recovered the security footage you claimed was accidentally damaged." Miller's face went white. He stared at the photos, his mind reeling. The coffee, the tape, the confession. It all came rushing back, no longer a minor detail in a forgotten case, but the linchpin of his own destruction. An innocent 18-year-old boy has spent 542 days in a cage because you were too arrogant and too prejudiced to do your job. Thorne's voice rose the calm finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. You didn't see a suspect, you saw a stereotype. You didn't want justice, you wanted an easy collar. You coerced a confession, and you suppressed evidence that would have set him free. You destroyed a family. You destroyed a life. The real world has consequences for that officer. Consequences far beyond a citizen complaint. Miller finally broke. But it wasn't with remorse. It was with rage, the rage of a cornered animal. "You set me up," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Thorne. "This was never about that kid. This was about me and you. This is your revenge for that traffic stop." Thorne leaned back in his chair, his expression one of profound pity. "You still don't get it, do you, David? If it were just about revenge, I would have fired you on my first day. This is about justice. Something you've clearly forgotten the meaning of. My incident with you was just the crack in the wall that allowed us to see the rot inside." He stood up his full height, seeming to dominate the room. "As of this moment, you are terminated from the Bridgewater Police Department. Lieutenant Rossi will escort you to your locker to collect your personal belongings. Your badge and weapon are to be surrendered immediately. The district attorney's office has already been briefed. They will be filing charges for assault based on my complaint, and they are convening a grand jury to consider charges of official misconduct, evidence tampering and perjury in the case of Deshawn Peterson. You should retain an attorney." The finality of the words sucked the air from Miller's lungs. Fired. Criminal charges, perjury, prison. His world had completely and irrevocably collapsed. The king of Sector 4 was nothing. As Rossi stepped forward, Miller looked at Thorne one last time, searching for a hint of triumph of satisfaction. He found none. He only saw the cool, steady gaze of a man who was cleaning house. He was escorted from the building he had called a second home for over 2 decades, stripped of his badge, his gun, his identity. As he walked out the front doors into the blinding sunlight, a news van was pulling up. A reporter jumped out, a microphone in her hand. "Mr. Miller," she called out, "is it true you've been fired in connection with the wrongful conviction of Deshawn Peterson?" The story was already out. His name, once a source of pride and fear on the streets, was now a synonym for disgrace. He pushed past the reporter, his face a mask of shame and fury, and walked away into a future he had built for himself, one hateful act at a time. The hard karma had finally hit back, not as a single blow, but as an avalanche, burying him under the full weight of his life's cruelties. In the end, Officer Miller's downfall wasn't just about a single hateful act. It was about a lifetime of small compromises of prejudice left unchecked, and the arrogance of believing he was above the law he swore to uphold. The spitting incident was merely the spark that ignited a hidden powder keg of injustice. Chief Thorne's arrival in Bridgewater wasn't just karma. It was a reckoning for a system that had protected men like Miller for far too long. The release and exoneration of Deshawn Peterson served as a painful but necessary reminder that the fight for justice is never over. This story is a stark reminder that our actions, especially those we commit in the shadows, have a way of finding the light. What do you think? Was this justice served or a story of personal revenge? Was Miller a product of a broken system or the cause of it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved, you please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama, where karma always has the final say.